The following story is inspired by urban legends and documented folklore from the state of Maryland. It contains descriptions of supernatural events and demonic encounters that may be disturbing to some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. Turn down the lights and listen closely. The wind in rural Maryland has a way of carrying voices that don't belong to the living. It whistles through the ancient oaks and maples of the Black Hills, sounding less like a breeze and more like a long-forgotten sigh. It was into this heavy, expectant silence that the Miller family drove their station wagon on a humid Tuesday in October. They weren't looking for ghosts. They were looking for a fresh start. Thomas, a carpenter by trade, and Sarah, a freelance writer, had inherited the Thorne estate from a distant relative they had never met. To them, it was a debt-free home. To the locals in the nearby town, it was a place that the sun seemed to avoid. The house sat at the end of a long gravel driveway that crunched under their tires like breaking bone. It was a classic colonial structure, once white but now a weathered, ghostly gray. Its windows looked like hollow eyes staring out at the encroaching forest. As Thomas killed the engine, the sudden absence of noise was deafening. There were no birds chirping, no insects buzzing, just the oppressive weight of the Maryland humidity and the feeling that the house was watching them pull up. Young Leo, sitting in the back seat, clutched his stuffed bear a little tighter. "Daddy," he whispered, "why is the house so sad?" Thomas tried to laugh it off, though a chill that had nothing to do with the weather ran down his spine. He stepped out of the car, his boots sinking into the soft, damp earth. The air smelled of wet leaves and something metallic, like old coins. As he walked toward the front porch, he noticed something peculiar. Resting on the top step, as if waiting for him, was a heavy, rusted iron key. It wasn't in a box or hidden under a mat. It was simply there, gleaming dully in the fading afternoon light. As Sarah and Leo joined him, Thomas picked up the key. It was unnaturally cold, so cold it seemed to bite into his palm. He pushed the key into the heavy oak door. The lock turned with a series of heavy, mechanical clicks that echoed deep inside the house, sounding like a giant waking up from a long slumber. When the door swung open, a gust of stale, frigid air rushed out to meet them. It carried the scent of dust, lavender, and a faint, underlying metallic tang that made Sarah wrinkle her nose in discomfort. They spent the afternoon moving boxes, their footsteps echoing through the cavernous rooms. The interior was beautiful, with high ceilings and intricate crown molding, but it felt occupied. Not by people, but by a presence that seemed to retreat into the shadows whenever they entered a room. Every time Thomas turned a corner, he felt a fleeting sensation of a hem of a garment disappearing or a door softly latching just out of sight. It was the kind of house that demanded your attention, making you feel like a guest in your own home. As evening fell, the Maryland woods began to transform. The silhouettes of the trees twisted into gnarled shapes against the purple sky. Sarah was in the kitchen, trying to get the old stove to work, when she heard a soft tink-tink-tink against the window pane. She looked up, expecting rain, but the sky was clear. On the glass, right at eye level, was a single perfect smudge, as if someone had pressed a forehead against the window from the outside, watching her work. She stepped back, her heart hammering against her ribs. When she called for Thomas, the smudge was gone, replaced by the reflection of the flickering kitchen light. Thomas tried to reassure her, blaming the old glass and the play of shadows, but as he turned away, he saw Leo standing in the hallway. The boy was staring at the floorboards near the cellar door. "The man under the floor says thank you for the key, Daddy," Leo said in a voice that was far too calm for a 6-year-old. A heavy silence fell over the hallway. Thomas looked at the iron key sitting on the counter. He had forgotten that he'd left it there, but now it was lying in a different position than before, pointing directly toward the cellar. The first night in Blackwood Manor had only just begun, and already, the boundaries between the world they knew and the world that hid in the dark were beginning to blur. Inheritance is more than just property. It is the history and the energy of those who came before. We must respect the places we enter, for we never truly know what remains behind in the silence. The first night in the Thorn estate was not a night of rest, but a night of listening. As the moon rose over the jagged Maryland treeline, the house seemed to settle into the earth with a series of groans that sounded far too much like human articulation. Thomas and Sarah lay in their bed, the sheets feeling damp despite the air conditioning. Every time Sarah drifted towards sleep, she was jolted awake by a sound she couldn't quite place. A rhythmic, heavy thrumming that seemed to vibrate through the very mattress. It wasn't the mechanical hum of a furnace. It was slow, deep, and steady, like the heartbeat of a slumbering giant. By 3 a.m., the witching hour, Sarah gave up on sleep. She felt a strange, magnetic pull toward the upper reaches of the house. While Thomas slept a heavy, troubled sleep, she grabbed a flashlight and slipped out of the room. The hallway was unnaturally cold, the air thick enough to feel against her skin. She found herself standing before the narrow, pull-down staircase that led to the attic. Earlier that day, Thomas had said the attic was likely empty, but Sarah felt a prickle of intuition, the kind of feeling a writer gets when a story is waiting to be told. The attic was a cathedral of dust and forgotten memories. Beams of moonlight sliced through circular porthole windows, illuminating millions of dust motes dancing in the air. As Sarah panned her flashlight across the space, she saw nothing but empty trunks and old, moth-eaten rugs. However, as she stepped further into the room, the rhythmic thrumming grew louder. She realized it wasn't coming from the floor, but from the walls themselves. She pressed her ear against a wooden support beam and gasped. The wood felt warm, and she could feel a distinct, slow expansion and contraction. The house wasn't just making noise. It was breathing. Terrified but driven by a need to understand, Sarah's light caught on a loose floorboard near the chimney stack. It didn't look like accidental damage. The wood had been intentionally notched. She knelt, her fingers trembling, and pried the board upward. Tucked away in a velvet-lined niche was a leather-bound book, its cover scarred by time and moisture. The leather felt slick, almost like skin, and as she touched it, the breathing of the house seemed to hitch for a moment, as if the building were holding its breath in anticipation. She opened the ledger. The ink was faded to a rusty brown, written in the cramped, elegant script of the 18th century. It belonged to Silas Thorne, the original builder of the manor. As she flipped through the pages, she saw records of crops, weather, and trade. But as the dates progressed toward the late 1700s, the entries became frantic. One page was covered in a single sentence repeated over and over: "The soil will not accept the seed until the shadow is fed." Beneath the text were strange diagrams, circles within circles, symbols that looked like weeping eyes, and a map of the property with a specific area in the woods marked with an X. A sudden, sharp crack echoed through the attic, like a whip snapping. Sarah spun around, her flashlight beam swinging wildly. In the corner of the room, the shadows seemed to be thickening, curling around the rafters like ink dropped into water. The breathing of the house suddenly accelerated, turning into a frantic, wet panting sound. The air became so cold that Sarah's breath hit the air in a white cloud. She felt a presence standing directly behind her. Something tall, something ancient, and something that had been waiting a very long time for someone to find that book. She didn't wait to see what it was. Sarah grabbed the ledger and scrambled toward the attic stairs, her heart thumping in time with the house's terrifying rhythm. She practically fell down the ladder, slamming the hatch shut behind her. She stood in the hallway, gasping for air, the old book clutched to her chest like a shield. The house immediately went silent. The breathing stopped. The cold vanished. It was as if the manor had achieved its goal. It had shared its secret, and now the real haunting could begin. When she returned to the bedroom, Thomas was sitting up, looking pale. "Sarah? I had the most horrible dream," he whispered, his voice shaking. "I dreamt that the walls were made of ribs, and we were inside something's chest." Sarah didn't say a word. She simply held up the ledger. She knew then that the Thorne estate wasn't just a house. It was a vessel, a living memory of a dark pact made centuries ago on Maryland soil. They weren't just inhabitants. They were participants in a ritual that had never truly ended. Curiosity is a powerful tool, but it must be tempered with wisdom. Seeking out the secrets of the past can bring light to the truth, but it also invites the shadows of those secrets to follow you back into the present. Morning in the Maryland backcountry usually brings a sense of renewal, as the mist rolls off the hills and the sun filters through the dense canopy of oak and hickory. But for the Miller family, the dawn felt like a thin veil stretched over a growing darkness. Thomas spent the early hours trying to convince himself that Sarah's discovery in the attic was merely a historical curiosity, not a harbinger of doom. He busied himself with the practicalities of rural life, unboxing tools and checking the perimeter of the property. Beside him was Buddy, their golden retriever, a dog known for his bravery against even the boldest of suburban squirrels. But today Buddy was different. The backyard of the Thorne estate bled into a dense, untamed forest that local maps simply labeled as the Hollows. As Thomas walked toward the edge of the woods to inspect a leaning fence post, Buddy stopped dead in his tracks. The dog's ears flattened against his skull, and a low, guttural growl vibrated in his chest, a sound Thomas had never heard him make. Buddy refused to step off the mown grass and onto the leaf-strewn floor of the forest. He stared into the shadows of the trees, his eyes fixed on a spot where the light didn't quite reach, baring his teeth at nothing but the silence. While Thomas struggled with the dog, young Leo had wandered to the far side of the porch, clutching a red ball. The boy was staring intently at a thicket of gray-bark trees about 50 yards away. The air had turned strangely still. The usual rustle of the wind had died down, leaving a vacuum of sound. Leo didn't look afraid, he looked mesmerized. He began to wave slowly, his small hand moving back and forth in a rhythmic motion. "He's very tall, Daddy," Leo whispered, not taking his eyes off the treeline. "And he doesn't have a mouth to say hello back." Thomas felt a wave of icy dread wash over him. He looked where Leo was pointing. At first, he saw only the vertical lines of the trees and the shifting patterns of the morning light. But then the perspective shifted. Between two ancient oaks stood a figure that seemed to be woven from the morning fog itself. It was impossibly thin and tall, perhaps 7 or 8 feet, wearing what looked like tattered, ash-colored colonial rags. Its skin, if it could be called that, was the exact shade of weathered stone. Most terrifying of all was the face. A smooth, featureless expanse of gray, devoid of eyes, nose, or a mouth. It stood perfectly still, blending so seamlessly into the woods that if you blinked, you might miss it. "Leo, come here. Now," Thomas commanded, his voice cracking with a fear he couldn't hide. He stepped toward his son, but as he moved, the figure in the woods mirrored him with a fluid, terrifying grace. It didn't walk. It seemed to glide behind the trunks, appearing and disappearing like a glitch in reality. Buddy's growling turned into a frantic, high-pitched yelping, and the dog finally broke, sprinting back toward the safety of the house with his tail between his legs. The gray man stopped at the very edge of the property line, its faceless head tilting to the side as if observing a curious insect. Thomas scooped Leo up in one arm and retreated toward the porch, never taking his eyes off the entity. Just as they reached the door, the figure raised a long, spindly arm and pointed a finger. Not at Thomas, but at the house itself. In that moment, the sun was obscured by a passing cloud, and the gray man simply vanished, dissolving into the shadows as if he had never been there at all. The only evidence of his presence was a sudden, sharp scent of ozone and the sound of a single heavy branch snapping deep within the woods. Inside, Sarah was waiting, the old ledger open on the kitchen table. Her face was pale as she pointed to one of the sketches in the book, a crude drawing of a tall, faceless figure standing amidst a circle of stones. Silas Thorne called him the Watcher of the Boundary, she said, her voice trembling. According to this, he isn't the demon, but he's the one who guards the gate. If he's showing himself, it means something is trying to come through from the other side. Something that the Thorne family promised to keep locked away. Leo sat on the floor, seemingly unaffected, and began to draw on a piece of scrap paper. When Thomas looked down, he saw his son had drawn a picture of their house, but with a giant, dark hand reaching out from the cellar to clench the roof. The partial peace they had hoped for was gone. The forest was no longer a sanctuary of nature. It was a wall of eyes, and the Watcher was making it clear that the Millers were trespassing on ground that had been claimed by a darker power centuries ago. Nature has its own guardians and its own boundaries. We must learn to listen to the warnings of the creatures around us, like the faithful dog, who often perceive the dangers that our human eyes are too stubborn to see. Night in the Maryland backcountry does not fall. It descends like a heavy, wet shroud. By the fourth evening, the atmosphere inside the Thorne estate had become so thick that it felt like walking through water. Thomas, driven by a frantic need to protect his family, had spent the afternoon boarding up the cellar door and checking the locks on every window. He was a man of wood and nails, a man who believed that anything could be fixed with enough sweat and steel. But as the clock's pendulum swung toward midnight, he began to realize that some things cannot be kept out by a deadbolt. The silence of the house was broken precisely at 12:01 a.m. It didn't start with a scream or a crash, but with a sound so rhythmic and deliberate it made the blood run cold. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of a heavy fist striking wood, but it wasn't coming from the front door or the back. The sound was vibrating from inside the walls of the living room. Thomas stood in the center of the rug, a heavy flashlight in one hand and a framing hammer in the other, watching the wallpaper. The rhythm moved, shifting from the west wall to the ceiling, then down into the floorboards beneath his feet. Sarah stood at the top of the stairs, her face illuminated by the flickering hallway light. "It's following the layout of the house, Thomas," she whispered. "It's measuring us." She was right. The knocking wasn't random. It was tracing the perimeter of the room they were in, circling them like a predator testing the strength of a cage. Every time the thump occurred, dust drifted down from the crown molding, and the smell of old, stagnant water filled the air. It was a physical, aggressive presence that seemed to be searching for a structural weakness. Thomas, fueled by a mixture of terror and carpenter's instinct, grabbed his measuring tape. He had spent the last hour studying the blueprints he'd found in the town archives earlier that day. "Sarah, look at this," he shouted over the increasing volume of the pounding. "According to the exterior measurements, this hallway should be 12 feet long. But look at the interior, it's only 8. He pointed to a section of the wall between the kitchen and the study. There was a 4-foot gap of dead space that shouldn't have been there. The knocking suddenly stopped right at that spot. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the noise. Thomas approached the wall, his hammer raised. He pressed his ear against the floral-patterned wallpaper. From the other side of the drywall, he didn't hear a ghost. He heard the sound of heavy, labored breathing and the wet sliding of something organic against the wood. It sounded like something large was trapped in a space far too small for it, struggling to turn around. With a roar of defiance, Thomas swung his hammer. The plaster cracked and gave way, revealing the lath and studding beneath. He tore away a large section of the wall, and what he found made him drop his tools in horror. Behind the modern drywall was a second wall, made of ancient, hand-hewn timber that appeared to be charred by fire. And in the center of this hidden wall was a small, iron-bound door, no more than 3 feet high. It was covered in the same weeping eye symbol Sarah had seen in the ledger. The iron latch on the small door began to rattle. A dark, oily substance, the same residue Sarah had dreamed of, began to seep from the cracks of the hidden door, hissing as it touched the floor. Thomas realized with a jolt of panic that the dead space wasn't a construction error. It was a deliberate chamber, a soul box built into the very bones of the house to contain something that the original settlers couldn't kill. By breaking the outer wall, Thomas had inadvertently weakened the seal that kept the darkness tucked away. The knocking resumed, but now it was coming from inside the small iron door. It was no longer a measurement. It was a plea for entry. The house groaned, the floorboards tilting at impossible angles, as if the manor itself were trying to vomit out the secret hidden in its chest. Thomas grabbed a heavy bookshelf and shoved it against the hole in the wall, but he knew it was a temporary fix. The boundary had been breached, and the entity that had been knocking for centuries had finally found someone to answer. There is a difference between bravery and recklessness. When we encounter things we do not understand, we must seek to comprehend their purpose before we attempt to dismantle them. For some walls are built not to imprison us, but to protect us from what lies beyond. There is a specific kind of brittle silence that follows a moment of true terror. After Thomas shoved the heavy oak bookshelf against the breach in the wall, the house fell into a state of unnatural stillness. No pipes rattled. No wind sighed through the eaves. The Millers sat in the dining room, the glow of a few hurricane lamps casting long, flickering shadows against the walls. Thomas had insisted they eat, a desperate attempt to anchor his family to the mundane world of bread and soup, but the food sat untouched. The air in the room felt ionized, buzzing with the static charge that precedes a lightning strike. The dining room was dominated by a massive, gold-leafed mirror that had been a fixture of the Thorne estate for over a century. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, but tonight, the reflection it cast seemed distorted. As Sarah looked into it, she noticed that the room behind her appeared slightly different in the glass. The shadows were longer, and the doors she knew were closed appeared slightly ajar in the reflection. It was as if the mirror wasn't showing the present, but a version of the house that existed in a darker dimension. "We have to leave, Thomas," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the lamps. "This isn't just a haunting. The ledger says the Thorne family didn't just live here. They kept something here. We're standing on a lid, and it's opening." Thomas looked at his hands, which were still covered in the white dust of the drywall he had smashed. He wanted to agree, but a strange, heavy lethargy was beginning to settle over him. It was a mental fog, a feeling that leaving was simply too much effort, a common symptom of the Maryland heavy air legends where the land itself tries to claim its inhabitants. Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted. A thin layer of frost began to bloom across the surface of the soup bowls. Leo, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, pointed toward the ceiling. "The house is crying, Mommy," he said softly. Sarah looked up and gasped. From the ornate plaster medallion in the center of the ceiling, a thick, viscous liquid began to drip. It wasn't water. It was an oily, pitch-black substance that smelled of sulfur and old, wet earth. It fell with heavy, rhythmic splats onto the white tablecloth, staining the fabric like ink. The manifestation didn't stop there. As the black oil hit the table, the great mirror across the room began to vibrate. A low-frequency hum filled the air, vibrating in the family's teeth and marrow. Then, without a single person touching it, the glass didn't just break. It exploded outward. Shards of silvered glass flew across the room, but they didn't fall to the floor. Instead, they suspended themselves in midair for a heartbeat, glowing with a faint, sickly green luminescence, before embedding themselves into the walls in a perfect, terrifying circle around the family. In the empty frame of the mirror, the reflection didn't disappear. Instead, the silver backing peeled away to reveal a dark, shimmering void. Out of that void stepped a hand, long, gray, and spindly, with fingers that ended in points like a bird of prey. It gripped the edge of the gilded frame, the wood groaning and splintering under its touch. The watcher Thomas had seen in the woods was no longer content to stay outside the boundaries. It was using the house's own history, its own furniture, as a bridge into their reality. Thomas grabbed a heavy iron fire poker from the hearth, his instincts finally overriding the supernatural lethargy. He stepped between the mirror and his family, but as he did, the black oil on the ceiling began to flow faster, forming words on the white tablecloth in a jagged, archaic script. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes wide with horror as she read the message appearing before them. The debt is not in gold. The room shook with a sudden, violent tremor that knocked the lamps from the sideboard, plunging them into near-total darkness, save for the eerie green glow of the glass shards. A guttural, multi-layered voice, as if many people were speaking at once through a single throat, echoed from the void in the mirror. It didn't speak words they could understand, but the intent was clear. It was a demand. The entity pulled itself halfway out of the frame, its faceless head tilting toward Leo. The boy didn't scream. He simply stared back, his eyes reflecting the void. With a sudden burst of will, Thomas swung the iron poker, striking the frame of the mirror. The iron hissed as it met the supernatural wood, and a shock wave of cold energy threw Thomas back against the wall. The entity retreated into the void, and the shards of glass finally fell to the floor with a cacophony of tinkling sounds. The black oil on the ceiling stopped dripping, but the message on the table remained, a permanent stain on their lives. They were safe for the moment, but the house had made its point. The pact mentioned in the ledger wasn't a metaphor. It was a living obligation, and the entity believed the Millers were the ones sent to fulfill it. They were no longer just observers of a haunting. They were the currency in a demonic transaction. Honesty with oneself is the greatest shield. When we ignore the truth because it is inconvenient or frightening, we allow the shadows to grow. Facing a terrifying reality is the first step toward overcoming it, for darkness thrives in the space where we refuse to look. The town of Bucketsville looks like a postcard from a century ago. Charming brick storefronts, narrow cobblestone streets, and a silence that feels intentional. But as Thomas drove the station wagon away from the Thorne estate and toward the local historical society, he realized the beauty was a thin scab over an old wound. The Maryland air here felt different. It was thick with the weight of things unsaid. Every person he passed on the street seemed to lower their head, their eyes darting away from his Maryland license plate as if the very dust of the Blackwood manor on his tires was contagious. Thomas found the archives in the basement of a converted church. The air inside was cool and smelled of parchment and cedar. Behind a heavy oak desk sat Mrs. Gable, a woman whose skin looked like crumpled linen and whose eyes held the weary sharpness of someone who had seen too many sunsets and not enough dawns. When Thomas introduced himself and mentioned the Thorne estate, the woman's knitting needles stopped mid-stitch. The clicking sound died, replaced by a heavy, expectant pause. "You're the one who moved into Silas's folly," she said, her voice like dry leaves skittering across a porch. "Most people have the sense to let the dead sleep." Thomas ignored the jab and laid the leather-bound ledger on the desk. Mrs. Gable didn't touch it. Instead, she stood up and walked to a row of filing cabinets in the back, her movements stiff. She returned with a yellowed map from the 1700s and a series of court records. "Silas Thorne didn't build that house for his family," she whispered, leaning in so close Thomas could smell the peppermint on her breath. "He built it as a cage. You see, the land your house sits on was never meant for living. The local tribes called it the throat. They believed it was a place where the earth breathed in, taking whatever stepped onto its soil." As Thomas looked at the records, a horrifying picture began to emerge. In the late 1700s, the Maryland colonies were hit by a great blight. Crops failed, livestock died in the fields, and families were starving. Silas Thorne, desperate to save his lineage, supposedly ventured into the throat and struck a bargain with a presence the locals called the Gray Man, a demonic entity that predated the settlers. The deal was simple. The land would become fertile, and the Thorne family would become wealthy, but in return, the house built upon the land would serve as a permanent gateway. "The dead space you found," Mrs. Gable continued, her voice trembling slightly, "it's called a sin-eater's cradle. It's a pocket of reality where the entity resides within the house. Silas didn't just live there, he fed it. He'd leave a chair empty at every meal. He'd leave the iron door unlatched on the night of a red moon. But eventually, the Thorne bloodline grew thin, and the Watcher, the Gray Man you saw, came to collect. The family didn't die out, Mr. Miller. They were taken, one by one, until only the house remained." Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. He thought of Leo waving at the faceless figure in the woods. He thought of the black oil forming the words, "The debt is not in gold." He realized then that the Watcher wasn't guarding the house. It was scouting. It was checking to see if the new inhabitants were suitable replacements for the Thorne family. The entity wasn't a ghost. It was a hungry, ancient force that viewed their presence as a formal reopening of a restaurant that had been closed for decades. Before he left, Mrs. Gable grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "The ledger you have. Look at the very last page, the one stuck to the back cover. Silas realized too late that the Gray Man doesn't want your soul, Mr. Miller. It wants your legacy. It wants the youngest branch of the tree." The implication hit Thomas like a physical blow. The entity wasn't after him or Sarah. It was after Leo. The Watcher had been pointing at the house because that was where the prize was kept. Thomas ran back to his car, the engine roaring to life in the quiet town. As he sped back toward the estate, the Maryland sky began to bruise with the colors of an approaching storm, deep purples and sickly greens. He looked in his rearview mirror and saw a flicker of movement in the dense tree-line along the road. A tall, thin, gray shape was keeping pace with the car, moving through the forest with terrifying speed, its faceless head turned toward him. The secrets of the town had been revealed, but knowledge was a heavy burden, and Thomas knew that the Watcher was no longer content to wait in the shadows. Knowledge is a light, but it can also reveal the shadows we were happier not seeing. We must seek the truth not just to satisfy our curiosity, but to arm ourselves for the battles we didn't know we were fighting. The drive back to the Thorne estate felt like descending into a deep, dark well. As Thomas pulled into the gravel driveway, the Maryland storm finally broke, but it wasn't a cleansing rain. It was a torrential, suffocating downpour that turned the red clay soil into a thick, grasping mud. The house stood silhouetted against the lightning, looking less like a building and more like a jagged tooth rising from the earth. Thomas burst through the front door, the secrets of Bucketsville burning in his mind. But as the heavy oak door thudded shut behind him, he realized the atmosphere had shifted again. The watchful silence was gone, replaced by a low, vibrating hum that made his skin crawl. Sarah was sitting by the fireplace, but she wasn't the woman he had left an hour ago. She was huddled under a heavy wool blanket, though the temperature in the room had soared to a sweltering, humid heat. The hearth, which should have provided comfort, was flickering with a strange, violet-hued flame that didn't seem to cast any warmth. Leo was nowhere to be seen. When Thomas called out to her, Sarah turned slowly, her eyes looking glazed and distant, as if she were seeing him through a thick sheet of ice. "He's been talking to me, Thomas?" she whispered, her voice sounding thin and metallic. "The man in the wall. He says you brought the rot with you." The conflict began not with a physical blow, but with a psychological siege. The entity was no longer just moving furniture or leaking oil. It was occupying the hearth, the emotional center of the home. Thomas tried to reach for Sarah, to tell her about Silas Thorne and the Sin-Eater's cradle. But as he stepped closer, the air around him suddenly plummeted to sub-zero temperatures. He could see his own breath in a frantic white cloud, while inches away, Sarah was sweating in the oppressive heat. The house was dividing them, creating two different realities within the same room. From the corners of the ceiling, whispers began to spiral down like dry leaves. They weren't in English, yet the meaning was clear. The voices told Thomas that Sarah was hiding the iron key. They told Sarah that Thomas was planning to leave her behind in the woods. The demonic presence was a master of the wedge, finding the tiny cracks of fear and exhaustion in their marriage and driving a crowbar into them. Thomas felt a sudden, irrational flash of anger. He looked at the bookshelf covering the hole in the wall and saw it vibrating, as if something on the other side were laughing. "Where is Leo?" Thomas roared, his voice cracking the spell of the whispers for a moment. Sarah blinked, the glaze in her eyes shattering. She looked around the room in a panic. They both ran toward the stairs, but the staircase seemed to stretch, the hallway growing longer with every step they took. It was a spatial hallucination, a classic Maryland forest walk trick brought indoors. Every door they opened led back to the dining room, where the shattered mirror still lay on the floor, its empty frame now pulsing with a rhythmic, dark light. They finally found Leo in the center of the kitchen, sitting perfectly still. He had lined up all the kitchen knives in a perfect circle on the floor, the blades pointing inward toward him. He wasn't crying. He was humming a low, tuneless melody that Thomas recognized from the breathing sounds of the attic. When Thomas broke the circle and scooped the boy up, the house reacted with a violent physical convulsion. The floorboards buckled, and the violet fire in the hearth roared upward, turning into a pillar of black smoke that took the vague, towering shape of the gray man. The partial resolution came through a moment of sheer, desperate honesty. Thomas grabbed Sarah's hand, crushing it in his own. "It's the house, Sarah. It's not me and it's not you. It's the debt." He screamed the words over the howling wind that had somehow found its way inside. The realization that their emotions were being manufactured by the entity acted like a cold bucket of water. The hallucinations of the long hallway snapped back to size, and the oppressive heat vanished, replaced by the natural chill of the Maryland night. They retreated to the master bedroom, the only room with a working lock, and barricaded the door with a heavy dresser. But as they sat in the dark, huddled together, they heard a soft, rhythmic scratching on the other side of the wood. It wasn't the heavy knocking from before. It was the sound of a single fingernail tracing the outline of the doorframe. The entity had failed to turn them against each other, so it was moving to its next phase. The storm outside intensified, and through the window, Thomas saw the moon beginning to take on a sickly, reddish hue. The night of the red moon had arrived earlier than the records predicted. The greatest strength of a family is not in their physical protection, but in their emotional unity. Darkness always seeks to divide before it conquers, for a house divided against itself cannot stand against the shadows. The sky over the Maryland woods had turned a bruised, cinematic crimson. The red moon, a phenomenon the local legends called the blood eye, hung low in the sky, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to detach themselves from the trees and crawl toward the house. Inside the barricaded bedroom, the Millers sat in a tight circle. The scratching at the door had stopped, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like the house had been plunged underwater. Then, a sharp, rhythmic tapping came from the window glass 3 stories above the ground. Thomas jumped, his hand gripping the fire poker, but Sarah gasped as she saw a familiar face through the rain-streaked pane. It was Mrs. Gable. The elderly historian was standing on the narrow, precarious ledge of the house, her shawl whipped by the wind. In her hand, she held a heavy iron lantern and a leather pouch. Thomas threw open the window, hauling the old woman inside just as a bolt of lightning illuminated a tall, gray shape standing on the lawn below, looking up with its faceless head. "The time for hiding is over, Thomas Miller," Mrs. Gable wheezed, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. "The red moon has opened the throat of the land. If you stay in this room, you are merely waiting for the harvest. You must reclaim the hearth using the old ways." She reached into her pouch and pulled out a handful of coarse, gray salt mixed with iron filings. Silas Thorne forgot that while a pact can be made with darkness, the earth itself provides the cure. But you must be brave. The house will not let you walk the halls freely. The plan was a ritual of the elders, a traditional Appalachian and Mid-Atlantic folk defense used to seal a tainted home. They needed to create a halo, a circle of protection in the center of the house, using salt for purity and iron for strength. But to do so, they had to descend from the safety of the bedroom, through the dark heart of the manor, to the very spot where the sin-eater's cradle was hidden behind the wall. The entity knew they were coming. As they stepped into the hallway, the floorboards didn't just creak, they shrieked like living things. As they descended the stairs, the air became thick with a freezing fog. Mrs. Gable led the way, chanting in a low, rhythmic tone that seemed to push back the encroaching shadows. Thomas held Leo close, while Sarah carried the pouch of salt. The walls of the house began to warp, the portraits of the Thorne ancestors turning their heads to watch them pass, their painted eyes weeping the same black oil they had seen in the dining room. Every step felt like walking through deep mud, the house trying to physically slow their progress toward the kitchen. When they reached the dead space Thomas had broken open earlier, the bookshelf he had used as a barricade was gone. Not moved, but simply erased from existence. The small, iron-bound door was wide open, revealing a vertical tunnel of absolute blackness that seemed to lead down forever. The smell of sulfur and ancient rot was overwhelming. "Now," Mrs. Gable commanded. "The salt. Create the boundary." Sarah began to pour the salt and iron mixture in a wide circle around the hidden door, her hands shaking. As the first grains touched the floor, the house erupted in a cacophony of sound. The pipes began to bang with the force of hammers, and the violet fire in the hearth flared up, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like grasping hands. A low, guttural growl vibrated through the floorboards, and the watcher appeared at the end of the hallway, its form flickering like a dying light bulb, its spindly arms reaching out toward Leo. "Keep pouring," Thomas shouted, stepping to the edge of the circle and brandishing the iron poker. He felt a wave of crushing despair wash over him, a psychic attack from the entity trying to make him drop his guard. He saw visions of the house collapsing, of his family lost in the Maryland woods forever. But he held his ground, focusing on the rhythmic sound of the salt hitting the wood. The circle was almost complete, a shimmering line of gray against the dark floor. As Sarah joined the last few inches of the circle, a shockwave of white light rippled outward. The gray man let out a silent, jarring scream, its form dissolving into a cloud of ash that was sucked back into the dead space. The iron-bound door slammed shut with a finality that shook the entire foundation. For the first time in days, the air felt light. The breathing of the walls stopped. But Mrs. Gable didn't look relieved. She looked at the red moon through the window. "The gate is latched," she whispered. "But it is not locked. The entity is now trapped inside the walls with us. The true battle of wills begins at the moon's peak. Tradition and wisdom are the anchors that keep us steady in a storm. We must respect the knowledge of those who came before us, for they have already walked the paths we find ourselves lost upon. Preparation is the bridge between fear and victory." The peak of the red moon brought a silence so absolute it felt like the world had ceased to exist outside the walls of Blackwood Manor. The Maryland woods were bathed in a terrifying, crimson light that bled through the windows, turning every shadow into a pool of dried blood. Inside the salt and iron circle, the air was still, but the house itself was undergoing a horrific transformation. The wallpaper began to peel back in long, wet strips, revealing not lath and plaster, but a pulsing, vein-like network of roots that seemed to be drinking the moonlight. The watcher was no longer a distant observer. The gray man had been pulled back into the house by the ritual, and now, trapped by the salt, it began to manifest with a desperate, violent intensity. It didn't appear as a solid figure this time. Instead, it became a swarm of shadows that skittered across the ceiling like giant insects. The multi-layered voice returned, no longer a whisper, but a roar that vibrated the very bones of the Miller family. "The branch is mine," it bellowed, the sound coming from the fireplace, the walls, and the floor all at once. Thomas stood at the edge of the salt circle, his knuckles white around the iron poker. He felt a sudden, sharp pressure in his mind, a psychic clawing as the entity tried to find a way in. It showed him horrific images of the future. Leo growing old in the basement of this house, his face becoming smooth and gray like the Watcher's. It was trying to break Thomas's spirit, to make him believe that resistance was futile. Beside him, Sarah was chanting the words Mrs. Gable had taught her, her voice a steady anchor against the tide of demonic static. The floor within the circle began to tilt and buckle. The entity was trying to physically break the line of salt by warping the wood beneath it. "Don't let the line break," Mrs. Gable screamed, her hands pressed against the floorboards as if she could hold the house together with her own strength. Suddenly, the shadows on the ceiling converged, dropping down into the center of the room in the shape of a massive, clawed hand. It slammed into the invisible barrier of the circle, sparks of blue and white light erupting at the point of contact. Leo, who had been huddled in the center, suddenly stood up. His eyes weren't focused on the shadow hand. He was looking at the small, iron-bound door of the Sin Eater's cradle. "He's not hungry for me, Daddy," Leo said, his voice strangely resonant. "He's hungry for the promise." The boy walked toward the edge of the circle. Before Thomas could grab him, Leo reached into his pocket and pulled out the rusted iron key he had found on the porch the very first day. The key was glowing with a fierce, white heat. The demonic entity recoiled as if the key were a brand. The gray man's form flickered, revealing for a split second the terrified faces of the Thorne family members who had been taken centuries ago. They were trapped within the entity's essence, a collective of lost souls fueling its power. Thomas realized then that the debt wasn't a contract to be paid. It was a cycle of fear that had to be broken. The entity didn't have power over them unless they accepted the role of the victim. "We are not the thorns," Thomas shouted, his voice echoing with a newfound authority. He stepped out of the circle, a move of incredible risk, and placed his hand over Leo's on the glowing key. Sarah joined them, her hand over Thomas's. The three of them stood together, a united front of living will against the ancient shadow. The iron key pulsed one last time, and a wave of pure, white energy surged through it, striking the iron-bound door. The door didn't just close, it fused shut. The metal melted and flowed into the cracks, sealing the cradle forever. The gray man let out a final, ear-piercing shriek that shattered every remaining pane of glass in the house. Then, as quickly as the storm had begun, the red light of the moon faded. The shadows retreated into the corners and dissolved. The oppressive weight lifted, replaced by the cool, crisp air of a Maryland autumn morning. The entity had been driven back into the earth, the gate locked not with salt, but with the refusal to be afraid. They stood in the wreckage of their living room, gasping for air. Mrs. Gable sat on the floor, her face etched with exhaustion but her eyes bright with triumph. The house felt empty, not the lonely, haunted emptiness of before, but the clean, hollow space of a vessel that had finally been drained of its poison. The red moon set behind the hills, leaving the world in the gray light of dawn. They had survived the night, but they knew the landscape of their lives had been changed forever by what had transpired in the dark. Fear is a predator that feeds on the isolated and the silent. When we stand together and refuse to accept the roles that darkness assigns us, we reclaim the power over our own stories. True bravery is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else is more important. The true dawn after the night of the red moon was a gentle, almost hesitant thing, as if the sun itself was unsure if it was welcome in Blackwood Manor. The oppressive red light had given way to a soft, golden glow that slowly filtered through the shattered windows. The air, once thick with sulfur and fear, now smelled of damp earth and the promise of a new day. The house was a wreck. Glass shards glittered on the floor, furniture was overturned, and the walls bore the ugly scars of the entity's rage. But amidst the chaos, a profound stillness had settled, a peace deeper than any the Millers had known since their arrival. Mrs. Gable, her face pale but resolute, gathered her belongings. "The gate is locked, not destroyed," she explained, her voice hoarse from the night's chanting. "It will sleep now for perhaps another century, but the land remembers. You must tend to it, not just the house. Understand that this land carries a deep memory, and it requires respect." She looked at Thomas and Sarah, her eyes holding a deep understanding. "You have broken the cycle. The Thorne family's debt is finally paid, not with blood, but with courage." As she prepared to leave, Mrs. Gable turned to Leo. "You little one," she said, touching his cheek. "You saw the key and you understood its purpose. You carry a light that the darkness cannot extinguish. Always remember what you saw here, and always trust the quiet knowing in your heart." With a final, weary nod, she stepped out into the early morning light, disappearing down the gravel driveway like a wisp of fog. The Millers were alone again, but this time the silence was their own. Thomas and Sarah spent the next few days in a daze, cleaning the house. They patched the broken walls, swept away the glass, and repaired the shattered furniture. As Thomas worked, he found himself looking at the house differently. It was no longer just a building. It was a living entity, scarred but resilient, just like them. He filled the sin-eater's cradle with fresh mortar and stone, sealing the iron door not with fear, but with intention. He wasn't just fixing a wall. He was rebuilding a boundary of peace. Sarah, meanwhile, revisited Silas Thorne's ledger. She found the final page Mrs. Gable had mentioned, stuck to the back cover. It was a single, hastily written entry. The true binding is not of iron, but of refusal. Refuse the fear, and the chains cannot hold. She understood then. The entity hadn't needed their souls. It had needed their fear, their willingness to play the role of the tormented. By refusing to be afraid, by standing together, they had starved the demon of its true sustenance. The house slowly began to breathe again, but this time, it was a gentle, contented sigh. The air no longer carried that metallic tang. Birds returned to the trees, their songs filling the silence that had once been so oppressive. Buddy, the golden retriever, ventured out into the backyard again, sniffing the grass with renewed curiosity, occasionally casting a glance toward the woods, but without the former terror. The gray man was gone, or at least dormant. The Miller family chose to stay in Blackwood Manor. It was their home now, earned through a trial of fire and shadow. They understood that the land required respect. They planted a vibrant garden where the black oil had dripped, tending to the soil with careful hands. They left offerings of fresh water and wildflowers at the edge of the woods, a gesture of peace toward the unseen forces that still slumbered there. Leo no longer spoke of the man under the floor. Instead, he often drew pictures of a bright, shining key, or of a family standing together, holding hands against a dark storm. He carried a quiet wisdom beyond his years, a deep respect for the unseen boundaries of the world. The experience had forged them, transforming them from a family seeking a fresh start into a unit that understood the profound strength of their bond. Life in the Thorne estate was never truly ordinary again. Every now and then, on a particularly still night, Thomas might hear a faint, rhythmic thump-thump-thump from deep within the earth, a reminder that the land's old memories never truly fade. But when he did, he would simply reach for Sarah's hand, and they would look at Leo, sleeping peacefully in his bed. They had faced the deepest shadows of Maryland's folklore and emerged not unscathed, but unbroken. They had learned that true haunting often lies not in what lurks in the darkness, but in the fears we allow to take root within ourselves. Resilience is not about avoiding the storm, but learning to dance in the rain. We overcome our greatest fears not by fighting them head-on, but by finding the courage within ourselves, strengthening our bonds, and remembering that some debts are paid by simply refusing to pay them.